Anybody remember what we talked about last week?
Oh, I remember the rejoice week.
You remember the rejoice week? Yeah.
We talked about the open secret.
Yeah. The main theme, though, wasn't it about learning to be content in whatever state that you find yourself? Very important theme for Paul. Very important theme for us. To learn to be contented in the Lord in whatever state that we might find ourselves. I have wondered, well, I won't get into that. The rest of the book of Philippians is pretty easy to get a hold of. A couple of things in the very next passage, but Paul has talked about his contentment, and then he turns from that to, in verse 14, to once again, in a sort of indirect way, thanking the Philippians for their support for him, because they were basically the main church that did that, maybe the only church for that. He thanks them for their concern for him. Nevertheless, you have done well that you shared in my distress. And he goes on to say that that was the only church that did that. We'll come back to that in a minute. But then after that, there is a doxology. Anybody know what the word doxology means? Doxos is the Greek word for glory. Logos is something like study of or a word about. So glory words is a sort of a literal translation. The ology is from the same word that logos, the word, comes from. So it's a word of praise or a word of glory about the Lord, about the Lord's glory. And you see the word glory in this particular one in verse 20. Then there is a greeting. And this is quite common for Paul to greet the churches, both the church that he's writing to, and sends his greetings from the church or area where he is. And in this particular case, likely he's in Rome. So he wants to greet the church. And then the very last verse of Philippians is a benediction. Does anybody know what a benediction is? What that means literally?
Bene means good.
Bene means good, yes.
Saying good things.
Yes, yes. Diction, dictate, that kind of thing. So yes, it means good word or a good saying, a good expression of something. And so he's wishing a good thing on the Philippian church. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you. We'll come back to that as well. So Paul is grateful as we look at verse 14. He's grateful, begins his section of his gratitude and for what the Philippians have done. So let's just read this section down to verse 19. Nevertheless, you have done well that you shared in my distress. Now you Philippians know also that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia, no church shared with me concerning giving and receiving, but you only. For even in Thessalonica, you sent aid once and again for my necessities. Not that I seek the gift. That's an important little statement there. Not that I seek the gift, but I seek the fruit that abounds to your account. Indeed, I have all and abound. I am full, having received from Epaphroditus the things sent from you, a sweet-smelling aroma, an acceptable sacrifice, well-pleasing to God. And my God shall supply all your need according to his riches and glory by Christ Jesus. Now, I have emphasized both last week and I want to emphasize again this week that in the ancient world, in the Roman world, the Greek world particularly, there was always a problem with gift giving. You remember we talked about that a little last week. And Paul has received, as he says here, repeated support from the Philippian church. Even when he left Philippi, went down to Thessalonica, several times they sent aid to him to meet his needs. And they were the only church that did that, at least at this point. The only one. The others have received but not been giving. But the Philippians learned to receive as well as to give, and they were generous in their support and love for Paul, expressed by that support. But the problem was in the ancient world that giving and receiving had nothing to do with your religion, but it had a lot to do with what's called patronage. If somebody gave you something, they put an obligation on you to return that gift in kind or in some other way. They might call upon you politically, for example, to vote for them or to support them in a civil war or something. So gift giving it wasn't just, oh, I'm going to give you this because you need it. It was a way of binding people together and cementing obligations. So rich people often were very generous to the poor. Why? They wanted their support because everybody knew that if you accepted the money, you said thanks for it, and you acknowledged the gift, then you were in a position of having to return the favor at some point in some way demanded by the person that gave you the gift. You owed them, in other words. Well, Paul is not wanting to put himself in a position with the Philippians where they are giving him something and he thanks them for it, and now he owes them in kind. Because he wasn't, for number one, he didn't have the resources to do that. And number two, he was going to be traveling and going to other places and depending on the support of others. And so therefore, he couldn't return it to the Philippians if he had wanted to. So what he is doing in this passage is he is thanking them indirectly, but he is making it clear that he is not the one that's going to pay them back. He is not writing them saying these kind things about their support in order to receive more from them either. You know, sometimes people do that. They're looking for more of something, more of a gift. And that's why I said it was important that, not that I seek the gift. He's not writing to them expressing his appreciation for all they've already done in order for them to do it again. He's making that very clear. In fact, he goes on to say, but I seek the fruit that abounds to your credit. He's looking for ways to show appreciation to them in which they will get the credit for it. With who? With God, with the Lord. He says, I have all, and I have all and abound. I am full, having received from Epaphroditus the things sent from you. So Epaphroditus is the one that we talked about before, who carried the gift from Philippi to Paul, a long journey and a dangerous journey, especially carrying gold and silver and whatever other way there might have been gifts sent to Paul, whatever they might have been. Very likely just money because of the length of the journey and the kind of journey it was. And so Paul is not wanting to receive again from them. He's not hinting in an indirect way that he needs more from them. He's saying, I have sufficient at this point. Now, the important thing that we're going to see here is that Paul has changed giving, or is in the process of changing giving and receiving, from this patronage system where somebody with resources gives them to somebody else and is now owed by them. That they owe it back to that person that gave. He is changing it from a purely political, financial thing between two people to involve a triangle now. Because where does Paul and where do Christians see all good gifts coming from? From God. Absolutely. So even when we help one another, there have been instances in this church where I've seen great generosity poured out helping somebody that needed it. And that continues from time to time. And a lot of it goes on that the rest of us never even know about. People give money, give things, and the rest of us, and rightly, we don't even know about it. People are generous. But where does that come from? Who do you thank when you receive a gift from somebody like that? Well, of course you're going to thank the person that gave it to you. But even more, you're going to thank God because God is the one working in that person who motivated that person to give it to you. And ultimately, we believe that all resources, everything belongs to God, right? And so when we receive gifts, we always thank God, even though we know an individual gave it to him. It reminds me in a sort of a positive way of something negative, that if you ever lived where there's a lot of farmers, well, in Kentucky, the first church that I pastored, it was out in the country. The church was in the country. It was not in the town. It was sitting out in the field and had a little parking lot around it and a little pastorium. It was nice pastorium right there. And the rest of it was farmland, and there were farmhouses that you could see from there, but it was in the country. And I had never lived among farmers before. And more than once, when I would talk about, well, we need to thank the Lord for this and for that, some of those farmers would say, well, you know, it's true. We've got to thank the Lord for what the Lord did, but I'm the one that plowed the field. I'm the one that planted the seed. I'm the one that harvested it. I'm the one that put the irrigation system in, or the drainage system, or whatever, you know. Go on and on. They're the ones that trimmed the tobacco and plowed the tobacco and did all the weeding. Almost resentful that the rest of the church was giving God the credit for their success on the farm. Well, you know, in their better moments, they knew that they could plant, but the harvest comes from God, because they knew that if they didn't have the rain, which they couldn't create, if they didn't have the proper sunshine, they didn't have the proper this, proper that, the right temperatures and right this and right that, you know, that too much rain, not enough rain, insect infestations, etc. If the Lord didn't provide that, even that they weren't going to receive it. So in their hearts, they knew that they needed to thank God for the crops that they were provided.
The farmer should thank God for keeping them in good health. Because you can't do all of that stuff when you're down, leg hurt, arm hurt.
Yeah, some of them had a little crisis when it came to harvest time, whether they should harvest on Sunday or not. Some of them did, and some of them didn't. Some of them just would not do it on work on Sunday. Some of them did. Some of them did. Well, all right. So Paul is looking for what is to their credit, but he is also expressing in this way that he does not have an obligation to them. But he says a wonderful thing about their gifts to him. Down there in at the end of verse 18, he said he had received from Epaphroditus things sent from you. And then he launches into Old Testament language, sacrificial language, to describe this offering that they have sent to him. He says, it is a sweet smelling aroma. You know where that comes from? What that refers to?
Oh, the laws that God gave Moses for the children of Israel on how to prepare the sacrifices, and when done properly, they would be to him a sweet aroma.
And also the incense that would go up as part of the sacrifice, the smoke from the sacrifice that was being offered to God out of love, out of covenant keeping, and so on. Yes, over and over and over in the Old Testament, in the law of Moses, particularly in those books, there is a lot about sacrifices, burnt offerings that would smell sweet to the Lord. They also didn't smell sweet if they were offered for the wrong motive. It was just nothing if it was offered. We're going to see a lot of that in Jeremiah, I think. Well, I know we'll see a lot of that in Jeremiah. When sacrifices and worship observances are done for the wrong reasons. But Paul is expressing his appreciation to the Philippians in a very positive way, a very Old Testament way, of saying that their offering to him, like a burnt offering, offered in the right way, the right kind of an offering, and offered in the right way, was pleasing to God because it smelled good to God. Is that you see the picture of the smoke of the incense, or the smoke of the sacrifice itself, rising to heaven, and God smelling it, and it was a sweet smelling aroma in his eyes. An acceptable sacrifice. Now, what makes a sacrifice acceptable or not?
How your heart is.
All right, that's the first thing. The motivation for offering that sacrifice.
And in the Old Testament, if it's done the correct way, God had specific ways the sacrifice was to be done. So
Okay.
I don't know that would definitely apply in the New Testament.
Well, but that's where this idea of an acceptable sacrifice comes from the Old Testament, from it being offered with the right motive, in the right method.
In pure firstborn, well, back then, firstborn.
Okay.
Pure.
That the sacrifice itself, the animal that or whatever was being sacrificed, was part of the best that you had. You didn't take a goat or a sheep with a broken leg or otherwise some blemish that it had. It was to be a perfect one. And so those three factors entered into making a sacrifice acceptable. And probably the most important one is the motivation. In the New Testament would be the motivation for making this sacrifice. So Paul is looking upon all that the Philippians had sent him through Epaphroditus as equivalent in the Old Testament to a sacrifice. And remember, much of the sacrifice system of what was sacrificed actually went to support the priesthood. So, like in the Old Testament, they are offering a sacrifice, not a burnt offering, but resources that would enable Paul to continue his ministry, so like the priesthood in the Old Testament could continue theirs because of the sacrifices. That's how they were supported. Remember, the Levites didn't have their own lands. Their portion was the Lord. So this is a beautiful thing to say to the Philippians. If you know the Old Testament, now remember they're Gentiles, most of the Philippians were. So, but obviously they had been taught, and Paul could say these kinds of things, and they would understand that these things are coming out of the Old Testament that they had been learning from their Jewish teachers, including Paul himself. So the third thing he says, it's well pleasing to God. If you offer a sacrifice that is offered in the right way, with the right motive, with the right kind of animal or fruit or whatever you're offering, oil, if you did that all properly, then the sacrifice would go up to God and God would be pleased with it, well pleased with it, if all of those conditions were met. Now we're going to see in Jeremiah where the Lord just stopped the sacrifices. I don't care about this because it's not being offered with the right motive. It's not being offered in the right way, and it's not pleasing to him. But this sacrifice that the Philippians were making to help Paul was well pleasing to God, Paul says. And what else can you do when you give other than to try to please God?
Or you do.
Huh?
Or you do, if you have a project to take it on, you want to make sure it's pleasing to the Lord.
Yes, absolutely. Things sometimes aren't. Yes.
In Hebrews 13:15, it talks about let us offer the sacrifice of praise to God, which is giving thanks to his name, so giving thanks is acceptable and pleasing to him.
Yes, yes, praising him. This doxology that Paul will offer was also a kind of sacrifice that was offered to God. Have any of us ever offered a sacrifice to God that we knew good and well wasn't pleasing?
When you're angry at somebody and you go ahead and give an offering.
Okay, there's an example. Or you do it with the wrong motive altogether. I bring my tithe because it's the first of the month or whatever. Not because I really want to give to God. In fact, I'd like to keep it. I really could use the money for something else this month. But I'll go ahead and give it anyway because I'm supposed to. You think God's pleased with that? I think a lot of times we might as well just keep it because he's not happy. Now don't tell Pastor. Don't tell Pastor I said that.
Well, where did Paul get the stuff to sacrifice?
Well, he's not actually sacrificing. He's talking
okay.
about the gifts that the Philippians have given him, which he is comparing to a sacrifice in the Old Testament. Remember, the Philippian church wasn't a rich church. They were struggling. They were being persecuted to some extent. How much we don't really know, but they were facing some real problems.
Yeah.
So for them to give sufficient funds to support Paul, like they had been doing, and not just once, but a number of times, we don't know how many, but much more than once, even when he'd gone down to Thessalonica, which is still in Macedonia, even when he'd gone down there, they sent money to him, they sent support, so he could do what he needed to do. Now, Paul was perfectly able to make his own way with tent making, and a tent maker could do a lot of things, make a lot of things other than tents. But that was a big thing. That was a regular profession. So he could pay his own way. He could work. But if he had support sufficient to where he didn't have to work a whole lot or just a little, what was he going to do at that time? He was going to preach and teach and share the gospel with people. So they enabled his ministry. Just as you all and people all over this country like you enabled Joan and I to live in Africa for 30 years. Without worrying ever, not one time did we have to worry that we were going to have sufficient support for our ministry in Africa. Not only for our personal income, but also for the other things that we needed to do all over the country. And lots of different ways that money was spent, running a hospital and paying doctors and nurses, and not just missionaries, but other nationals, and doing publication work and running schools and building schools and so on. And you guys made that possible. You made us free to do our ministry without worrying about financial support, ever. Ever. I had friends that were independent Baptist missionaries, and once in a while they would make fun of us because we didn't have faith. They went to the field by faith, they said. And faith that these individual churches or individual persons would support them while they were overseas. And we said, well, actually, we think we've got more faith than you do. Why? Because we have faith in all of these 35 or 36,000 Southern Baptist churches, and they're all contributing to our support. And we trust all of them. We trust the Lord that He's motivating those churches to give, and He did. And as I said, again, not one time in all those years were we ever in doubt that we would be supported. I don't know if you know this, but the International Mission Board keeps a reserve of funds in the case there's some kind of a worldwide disaster and they have to bring all the missionaries home. Or from any given country, that you might have some kind of major war or something, like in World War II. A lot of the missionaries had to come home. They were in countries that were occupied by the Nazis or the Japanese or others, and so what the Philippians was doing in supporting Paul was a very great and good thing. And Paul likens it again to an acceptable, well-pleasing sacrifice to the Lord. And notice that their giving is pleasing to God. It pleases Paul too, of course. But when they give, their giving is motivated by God and motivated by their love of God, their love of the gospel. And so they give accordingly. That's a wonderful thing. But again, that triangle, you give, I give, you receive, I receive, but it's all from God and it's all motivated by God and love for God. So this was a brand new concept in the ancient world, because giving and receiving was just a human thing. It had nothing to do with the gods. Now, people offered sacrifice to the gods, but helping another person in their ministry, like helping Paul, that was a totally unheard of thing. And so Paul is teaching them that in these relationships of giving and receiving, God is the prime mover and the prime one to be thanked. And then he says in verse 19, and my God shall supply all your need according to his riches and glory by Christ Jesus. Now there he's putting the stamp on it, making sure that the Philippians understand that Paul, is not in obligation to them for them giving him these gifts. He's not the one that's going to return the favor. This is countercultural. It's against the culture of that part of the world. But what he is saying, that the one who owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, who owns everything and who has all the resources in the world, that one is going to supply the needs that you have. So he's going to reward you for your goodness and your love and your sacrifice. He is going to supply your needs, not Paul. It's a little strange to us, I suppose. You know, sometimes it's hard to understand portions of the Bible because our culture, we are so used to already having a Christian attitude about giving and receiving and those kind of, and many other things. And we've gotten used to it and realized that that's not the way most people work or ever have worked in their cultures. Just not. But it is for Paul. And he says, he speaks about God's riches and glory I think he's talking primarily about spiritual blessings here, although I don't think it excludes material blessings as well. Their giving wasn't so they would get. The health and wealth gospel that we look at and face today quite often, it seems so often that they are encouraging people to give to the Lord so that they will get. It's like an investment. You put your money with an investment firm with the purpose of interest being paid on your money, on the money that they have. They're investing it in corporations and so on. And so you're looking for a return on that investment. That's what an investment is. And unfortunately, people sometimes look at what they give to the Lord's work as an investment, and really what they're doing is they're giving expecting more in return. They're returning to the Roman Greek way of thinking when they think that way. That is not the biblical way to think about giving gifts. Yes, the Lord promises rewards. Yes, the Lord promises to meet our needs. But we don't give to support the Lord's work or to the church or to individuals who need our help. We don't give in order to get like an investment. You put in $100 and you expect to get 110 back. That is not what the scriptures teach anywhere. There is the sense that when you give to the Lord's work, yes, the Lord will bless you, but it may not be a material blessing. It may be material blessings. There may come a time when you need some help and others will help you. And that's from the Lord. But it is not a quid pro quo kind of thing where you give in order to receive back that plus more. That's the health and wealth gospel. That's not what I see in the scriptures at any rate. I hope you don't either. So any comment or question that you would like to raise about that section?
Oh, when they released all those Iranian prisoners, Iran, and we were flying to Algeria. So they made us sit on the tarmac all day. No air conditioner, no nothing. You couldn't imagine the cuss words that came out of all the roughnecks, drillers, tool pushers, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, I could. I was in the Marine Corps.
Yeah,
I could imagine.
yeah.
I have to imagine.
But they didn't want anybody in the air.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they fly through those guys that were strapped in Iran.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know who set that up. They made us sit there all, it was way up in the evening when we took off.
Mm-hmm.
And
How are you relating that to this, Frank? I'm not following.
I'm saying it had to be somebody that was a Christian, in other words.
Okay.
So what did, I mean, we never did figure out who it was.
I don't know. One of the things that most people don't realize is how much of our culture is Christian based. Even the far left in this country, when they start talking about taking care of the poor and the downtrodden and all of that, They do not realize that that is a Christian motivation and a Christian attitude that was not common in the world until Christianity became prominent throughout the world. If you go back and read the life of there's a British politician he was named William Wilberforce. Have you heard of Wilberforce? Yes. There's a movie about him called Amazing Grace not too long ago. He was the one that worked hard to eliminate the slave trade for like 30 years. Finally succeeded not long before he died. He was also involved in lots of things like orphanages and concern for workers being paid a livable wage for their work and being paid on time, and so on and so forth. Now, I only mention that because prior to that time, the governments weren't concerned about taking care of the people. The people were supposed to work and take care of themselves. There was no attitude that the government owed anybody anything. And we've gone the opposite extreme now where the government thinks it's totally responsible and the church is not doing much because the government's doing so much of it. Well, we'll come back and we'll look briefly next week at the greetings and the doxology, the benediction, and a little bit at the doxology. And remember the question I asked you last week. I'd like you to think about what you have learned from Philippians. One or two things that really strike you that have been personally beneficial to you from the book of Philippians. We'll spend some of our time doing that next week. The last few verses are not difficult here, so hopefully we'll get to that next week. God bless all of you, and those of you that are on the computer, we're glad you're there with us too today. Okay, go to worship. Jamie, did you have